What's up, folks? It's your boy, DJ Slate. I'm back here in the building with my co-host, Mr. Adam Michelangelo Novelli. He is in the building. This is the IB 20th Century Show, brought to you in part today by East Coastin', the brand right here. Purchased this in Kennebunkport, Maine. I'll show you here in a second. Boom. We are now live and direct. Here you go. Here's the logo. Yo, Novelli, I bought this in Kennebunkport, Maine. Honestly, I liked it because it kind of looked like a sickle. Can't even lie.
That sounds like a made-up place.
Yeah, it's not. Fun fact, the Bush family has a pretty fancy residence out there. And George Bush Sr., this was one of his favorite escape havens when he was president. And so he made it famous. He made this town famous. So we were there. I guess Tay-Tay, I don't know if you know who Taylor, what's her name? The singer, Taylor Swift. She filmed a music video there as well. So
that is good to know.
Yep. You know what else I learned is yesterday we were talking about Aberdeen. Kurt Cobain is from Aberdeen.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, but then I didn't want to be wrong, so I didn't say it. But
gotcha. Yeah, we had an observer reach out to us from Fife, Washington, and tell us that he was aware of Aberdeen being famous for Kurt Cobain as well. So shout out to the viewers out there in Fife who are jumping onto the show. Love to have you. And again, shout out to all of our kids out there that are watching. We are excited to teach you today a little bit more about Adolf Hitler and his methods used to rise to power. So you ready to get started, Novelli?
Oh, yeah.
Good. You want to have any other fun facts to share with us today before we get rolling?
No, but I will commit. I think that would be a good way to start some of these. So I'll start identifying some fun facts to kind of get the learning rolling when we do these.
Good. All right, man. Well, let's do this. All right. I'm going to go ahead and share here. You should see on the screen our slideshow. You got that on your screen over there, Novelli?
Yes, it's loading. Yep, okay. I got it.
All right, cool. All right. Well, hey, folks, the objectives. Let's not forget what we're doing here. We've already identified the conditions present in the rise of an authoritarian, and we're now on the unit dealing with the methods. There's 5 different methods that we're exploring: persuasion and coercion, role of leaders, ideology, use of force, and propaganda. Novelli, one thing that my kids ask a lot is, what's the difference between persuasion and coercion?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. What intuitively comes to your mind?
So persuasion to me would be a tool that would largely, at least in my mind, would be utilized through like verbal prose and maybe visualization too. So things like propaganda. Well, I guess we already have propaganda there. So persuasion would be more verbally asserted, whereas coercion would be more or less something like that would have the force of maybe somebody armed behind it. I don't know. What do you think?
Exactly the same. I like to think of it as the difference between somebody who walks up with their hands in their pockets and they say, go ahead and unload the cash register for me. You don't necessarily know what's going on in the pockets there. They may be implying they have a weapon. They may not be implying it. Nonetheless, they're saying, I need you to do something for me. And I think that kind of look at that as persuasion. Coercion is they pull the gun out, they got it right there, and they say, give me all the money out of the register. And the use of force is when they actually pull the trigger and use it. So that's the difference there. I agree with you that propaganda in many cases is tied directly to persuasion, that the propaganda is the fuel behind the persuasion. And then ideology is the fuel behind the propaganda.
So coercion kind of creates an illusion of choice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And here's the interesting thing when we talk about Adolf Hitler and coercion is he didn't even have to coerce people. He was able to kind of with a wink and a nod to his SA imply what he wanted. And he did that tacitly through not condemning the actions of the SA. So we'll talk about the beer hall push today. The SA is going to kind of go rogue. They're going to burn down a newspaper building, and Hitler can say, well, I didn't order them to do that, but he certainly didn't condemn them either. So he had this unique knack for allowing things to happen under his direction without having to claim responsibility for it. And it's eventually why he's going to have the entire rank and file of the SA murdered, because he grows fearful of the fact that this SA is possibly going to overthrow him. So there's an upside and a downside to not having explicit control over a group.
Yeah, and that's led by Rom, yeah?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, and he ends up being one of his only friends in the world at that time. And
Yep.
then he ends up having him killed. Pretty wild.
Wild. The context today, we're going to do some storytelling, basically, of the Munich Beer Hall Push. You are required to analyze how those 5 tactics we just mentioned were employed by an authoritarian leader. The Munich Beer Hall Push is one of the major examples that encompasses all 5 of those tools Hitler used in his attempt to assert power. He would be unsuccessful, but he's certainly going to use his time in prison to produce a trove of propaganda. In his own words, without his time in prison, he would not have written his autobiography, Mein Kampf. And so this beer hall push is going to indirectly assist in his rise to power, but it is going to be a failure of the use of force. Today, you should be listening along, taking notes. We will have a Google form ready for you to be answering questions as you listen. You can find that Google form in your Google Classroom. It's one way we're going to be able to measure the extent to which you are engaging with us as we teach. So, all right. Already covered this. So let's talk about this beer hall push. Here's the setting. It's November 1923, so wintertime. It's at the peak of hyperinflation. We've talked in great depth about the hyperinflation crisis in 1923. Germans everywhere are growing more and more disenchanted with the state of affairs in Weimar Germany. And to say that they were frustrated is an understatement. The beer hall in question is called the Burgerbrau Beer Hall. It's about a mile outside of Munich's city center. Beer halls were pretty common in Germany at this time. As a matter of fact, after Adolf Hitler would rise to power, I don't know if you know this, Novelli, but they would actually go back to this same beer hall every year and celebrate on the anniversary of this failed beer hall push. So this beer hall ended up being the site of an attempted assassination of Adolf Hitler. It would be blown up, and eventually I think it was hit by one bomb in World War II, and the bomb did not detonate. But yeah, isn't that kind of crazy?
That is.
Yeah.
Have you, with your students, have you kind of discussed kind of the cultural significance of beer halls in Germany and what
I have
that
not.
meant to? Okay.
Go for it.
Do you want? Okay, so beer halls, because this doesn't, I don't know if there's really necessarily a parallel in American society, but at this time, this was like the place where Germans would get together and have a lot of frank political discussions. And I know, given the context of how we discuss politics in this country, the thought of a bunch of people getting together where there's beer and having political discussions sounds like a nightmare. But in reality, in Germany, this is where a lot of consensus was being built. And if you kind of want to think about how like grassroots organizations work, this is where a lot of that got done. So it was by no mistake that Hitler chose to engage in this very famous event in a beer hall, because this is where a lot of political activity happened. This is where a lot of decisions were made. This is a place where consensus was built. So these were important institutions in Germany. It's not just a bar like we might think of them here in America. These were political institutions where consensus was intended to be built.
Kind of like our bowling alleys. That was for us in the 1950s, a place I think where not thousands of people would gather, but I remember an article I read back in my early days of teaching with Mr. Baki, an article called Bowling Alone. And it was an interesting article. It was talking about how the fact that people were no longer bowling together was having a damaging impact on the discourse that our population was having regarding our democracy. So anyways, do you bowl?
No. In fact, when you brought up bowling, I was like, wow, I could never contribute to any political life in the 50s because they would kick me out right away. I need the bumpers. I've got major issues with bowling.
I just saw an episode of Parks and Rec where Ron was pretty upset that another character was bowling with the ball between his legs, and he basically, this guy ended up winning the competition. So Ron came back later and bowled a 300 on a side alley with zero audience by rolling the ball between his legs. So it was pretty good stuff. Anyways, once again, we digress. Here's some of the actors. You got Hitler, who's at this point the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. A gentleman named Rosenberg, who's the editor of the NSDAP's official newspaper. This is where all the propaganda that Hitler wanted to spew across Germany, this is where he would do it through, is the Volkischer Beobachter. There's a gentleman named Gustav Kahr. He's the Bavarian state commissioner. You got to think of him kind of like a state governor in the state of Bavaria. Berchtold is the commander of what's a group in the SA called the Hitler Assault Squad. You're going to hear a gentleman named Göring, who at this time was the leader of the entire SA, and then General Ludendorff, a World War I hero and a NSDAP endorser. Those are some of the names you're going to hear in this story that you're going to want to be familiar with. So here we go. All right. On the morning of the 8th of November 1923, Hitler gets a hold of his buddy Rosenberg at the Volkischer Beobachter and says, give a heads up to the press that there's going to be something big going down at the Burgerbrau Beer Hall, and make sure you bring your pistol. So in case, Rosenberg didn't get the message that there was about to be some force employed, if not persuasion and coercion, it was right there when he said, bring your pistol. At 8 p.m., there were about 3,000 people gathered in the beer hall. So it's a party going down at the beer hall. Hitler pulls up in a red Mercedes, which, Novelli, is interesting. He ends up leaving the next day in a yellow Fiat. So Hitler apparently had a number of vehicles at this time. But, striking to pull up in a red Mercedes. At this time, there's a pretty boring speech being delivered inside the hall. Outside the hall, there's 125 members of the Hitler Assault Squad arming themselves. Here's a picture, low quality, of the Burgerbrau Beer Hall. You can see all those seats there. A lot of potential. When I saw this, I kind of thought of, for some reason, Harry Potter. This to me, I don't know what it is about the imagery here, but all those seats there, for some reason, I go to Harry Potter. Here's a picture taken of the assault squad loading up, preparing outside the beer hall. I think this was taken earlier in the day when they were leaving maybe the party headquarters, because it's November and 7 p.m. in November is a dark time. It's dark outside. So,
hey, I got a quick question.
Go ahead.
Are these assault squads, are they affiliated with the government in any way? Like, are these just paramilitary groups that are just armed and just guarding private citizens? That's kind of crazy, isn't it?
This is a significant criticism that Hitler's defense attorney levied at the actual trial. He said, these assault squads were trained by the Bavarian military forces. I don't see why is my client, Adolf Hitler, why is he in trouble for using the training that a government-sanctioned military organization provided to his assault squad, to the SA? It was, again, they were formally trained, and many of them former soldiers in the German, in the Reichswehr, the German military that fought in the First World War. So there was some Bavarian government sanctioning of the activities, or at least of the training of these men.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So Göring, 24 men come bursting into the beer hall shouting Heil Hitler. The rest of the 100 or so men that were out there come rushing in. They cover the windows, grab the phones, block the exits, and they assemble kind of along the walls. And people are probably wondering what in the world is going on here. Hitler, again, and who knows how much of this is propaganda that was told after the fact, when Hitler told these stories, but he allegedly takes a drink, stands up, jumps on the table, pulls a pistol out, and fires 2 shots in the air, yelling silence. A pretty bold use of coercion here.
Yeah, it's dramatic.
Pushes his way up to the front of the room, and there's 3,000 witnesses here. So obviously, if this were not the case, somebody would be no, that didn't happen that way, but this is what we have. Hitler pushes his way up to the front of the room, confronts the Bavarian minister, Carr, and essentially grabs the mic, says the national revolution has begun. He tells him there's 600 armed men that are in this hall. It was a lie. So nobody can leave. And then he states the government of Bavaria and Berlin, the government in Weimar, basically the government of Germany has been overthrown, and that the police headquarters and army barracks are under their control. So, the people in the hall in the Valley had no idea whether this was the case or not. It's not like they could, pick up their cell phones and text, hey, are you, where are you at right now? Are the police really under control? They couldn't verify for themselves. And so I think many of the observers there thought 2 things. 1, we're about to see this Carr guy get shot and killed, assassinated. And 2, there might be a new government right now. So kind of a big deal, man. Now, there were not 600 people, nor was the government of Bavaria or Berlin occupied by this new political party, this new government. Hitler was hoping that these 3,000 people would, by the end of the night, be on his side, and he almost pulls it off. He hopes that they end up becoming his revolutionary force. He then says, hey, come here, go into a side room with me. They go into this little side room and have a quick conversation. Hitler says, dude, I got 4 bullets in my gun, 1 for each of us. If I'm not victorious by tomorrow, we're all dead. I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to kill the 3 of you. And that's the end of it. He then leaves the room, goes back into the beer hall, gets the crowd all riled up, tells them that he loves Bavaria. He tells them that this revolution is not aimed at Bavaria. It's aimed at Berlin. So please don't take offense to what I'm doing. This is a necessity for us. One observer says he turned that room inside out like a glove and had them like putty in his hands. The audience is stomping and cheering their approval. You can imagine the 3 ministers in the side room hearing this, thinking, man, wow, this is wild. Listen to him getting them riled up out there. They're on his side. He then comes back into the room, says, you hear that? They're with me. And this is persuasion. It's, him saying to these 3 Bavarian ministers, like, I am the one. I'm the guy that's going to be able to lead these people, not you. And then to add dramatic effect, a war hero, General Ludendorff, enters the side room. Keep in mind that even bringing General Ludendorff into this day was a form of propaganda by Hitler. Anytime you can take an endorsement and spin it into, hey, everyone, look at me. Look at how good we are. Our movement is legitimized because of this. That's propaganda. And then to have Ludendorff say you need to join the great national cause is just adding a whole lot of weight behind the legitimacy of Adolf Hitler here. Carr replied in that moment, Your Excellency's wishes are my orders. He would later on deny that he ever made this claim. The 5 men then returned back out to the beer hall. The new provisional government would organize a march on Berlin tomorrow. Let's get ready. The crowd allegedly chanted Hitler's name and then sang the national anthem. And, Hitler's going to use this as propaganda to identify how fervent the support is behind him. So far, the push appears to be successful, but it's not the end. In a significant mistake, I think Kershaw kind of looks at it like a terrible decision. Hitler would leave the beer hall. He leaves to go figure out what's going on. He wants to find out why the members of his SA that were supposed to be at the train station weren't there yet. And the reason for going to this train station was to try to prevent the escape of what one Hitler supporter deemed the rabble of racial alien Jews from the East from riding away loaded with foreign exchange. They did not want any of the Jewish capitalists to escape Bavaria with foreign currency. Keep in mind that foreign currency was really the only valuable asset that Germans could have in their possession at this time. It was the only stable currency, because the German mark was certainly not stable at all. And so that's why they wanted to lock down the train stations. In Hitler's absence, Ludendorff would release these 3 Bavarian ministers, believing that they were on the NSDAP's team, that they were on their side. They had pledged their support to the cause, but this pledge was under duress. And as soon as they left the beer hall, they began their counter push. And so at this time, the SA are out and about the streets of Munich. They're tearing apart offices of the social democratic newspaper, the Munich Post. They are grabbing anyone who resembles a Jewish person off the streets and bringing them back into the beer hall. A quick pause here on this story, the Munich Post. The Munich Post is going to be a newspaper that from early on in Hitler's rise is going to portray him in a very negative way as bad for Germany. And they're going to continue to publish through the 1920s and into the 1930s before they are, essentially forced to shutter their building when Hitler gets to the chancellorship position. But the Munich Post, in a book called Explaining Hitler, written by Ron Rosenbaum, quote, produced some of the sharpest, most penetrating insights into Hitler's character, his mind, and his method through 1934. And this was one of the targets for the NSDAP. They were the first to tangle with him, the first to ridicule him, the first to investigate him, the first to expose this underside of his party. It was this sort of this dark underside, the murderous criminal behavior masked by its pretensions to being a political movement. They were the first to attempt to alert the world to the nature of the rough beast slouching toward Berlin. And in hindsight, we would realize that what they were trying to convince the world of was indeed the case. But at the time, Hitler was able to keep people under wraps, basically. Weimar Germany's political parties, just on a side note, had all of their own newspapers. So, what you believed ideologically, you read about in the newspapers. You didn't order, you wouldn't order the Munich Post if you were a Nazi. Just why would I do that? They don't share the same beliefs. So it's a very compartmentalized society. I think yesterday, Novelli, in our conversation before we went live, you had talked a little bit about that. You had an interpretation of German society that was, what'd you call it? Like fractionalized or fragmented?
Yeah, basically fractionalized, which makes sense given what we know about where society was at. The political division that we kind of talked about earlier. And, to some degree, I think we can see parallels within our own society where, for whatever the reason, it is common for people to want to congregate towards beliefs and ideals that subscribe to their own. So if you think about if there was a lot of, fractionalization politically within German society, they're going to be seeking out a lot of different mediums that are going to kind of confirm their worldview. So, this Munich Post.
Audio just cut out. I don't know if you can hear me or not. Can you hear me? Tell me when you can hear me. Let me know.
Hello?
Yeah, all right, I got you. All right, you said this Munich Post and then it cut out.
Oh, okay. So I think it's interesting. It kind of shows that, Hitler's support in Germany at this time certainly wasn't homogenous to any degree.
Yeah.
And so you did have institutions and by extension, people in society that also opposed him. Because I think that's kind of important to share when we're looking at the whole story. But all these political parties, you were talking about yesterday how Hitler's job following World War I was to kind of investigate some of these extreme groups. It's always important to have that lens that it's easy to get ourselves caught up into this idea of how we consume media today. But, obviously there was no internet, there were no phones. So newspapers were the most important way that someone's ideas could be shared.
Yeah.
So these newspapers, they hold a lot of weight in people's, how people consume their ideas and how people find out about the world around them. So it's important to look at this.
And you weren't gonna you had to buy every newspaper you read. So
Oh
you think
yeah,
about,
not free.
on the internet, you couldn't just read a newspaper by grabbing it at the newsstand and just reading it right there. You had to buy it. So people weren't going to spend their money on newspapers that had ideologies they didn't believe in. Why? I mean, that's be a waste of money and time. So at this point, the essays burning down the Munich Post. They took 64 Jews into provisional custody at the beer hall. It literally brought them into the beer hall, and you're not free to leave. And this is like 3 a.m. Okay, so it's crazy, man. Things are popping off in the middle of the night. Meanwhile, these 3 Bavarian ministers, under the leadership of Carr, they end up getting on a radio station, and they state unequivocally that they repudiate the Hitler push, that their expressions of support that were given in the beer hall were extracted at gunpoint, and as a result, they were invalid. Now, Carr is going to die for this act of treachery in the eyes of Hitler. On June 30th, 1934, an event called the Night of the Long Knives. Do not mention Night of the Long Knives anywhere in this unit. This is after his rise to power. But just to kind of, help you come full circle with Carr, these actions are not going to be forgotten by Adolf Hitler. So he declares the Nazi Party illegal in this radio address. He orders the arrest of Hitler and Ludendorff and other key supporters on site. He says anyone caught in Bavaria distributing newspapers would be put to death. So he said, no newspapers will be published tomorrow. I don't want anyone knowing that I was endorsing the NSDAP last night. And so he says no newspapers will be delivered. Anyone caught delivering newspapers will be put to death. So clearly desperation in the pleas coming from Carr at this time in the middle of the night. Hitler, at around the same time, 3 a.m., would be returning to the beer hall. And they kind of launch a Hail Mary at this time. Let's march through the streets. So they prepare to go on a march, and by noon the next day, everyone's exhausted. I mean, we're talking noon. So this has been overnight that people are in this beer hall, not able to leave. They're all providing, people are at the beer hall passing around flags with swastikas on them, and 2,000 people join Hitler after a full night of being held against their will. 2,000 people march toward the city center. Now, 15 minutes into this march, they get to a bridge where there's 30 police officers there. They're all telling the marchers to stop. They say nope. And as a matter of fact, they take 28 of these police officers captive. They continue marching, and officially they get to the city center in Munich, and they are met by a significantly larger force of police officers. You can see here, look at the mass of people that were part of this. And so they end up, think about this propaganda right here. Think about Adolf Hitler. If you're Hitler and you have this photograph right here, this right here speaks volumes as to the legitimacy of what you are stating to the people of Germany.
Is that Hitler in the center there?
No, it's not. I'm not quite sure who that is. I didn't do a lot of digging into it. It's definitely one of the officials in the NSDAP, though. I mean, it has to be.
Okay, and so these are all people in support.
I mean, sort of. Again, when you think about, why people go to events,
it's a spectacle.
It's a spectacle.
Yeah.
And so why they're there doesn't really matter when we're talking in terms of propaganda. Yes, every one of these people is a Hitler supporter in the eyes of Hitler. You say what these people are doing, not these,
that makes sense.
So it's a spectacle, and we're talking about a large city in Germany. And so Hitler's kind of marching forward with this massive group, and he's linked arms with a guy named Max, and Max gets shot dead. And when he crumbles, immediately drags Hitler to the ground, which dislocates Hitler's shoulder. Goring was shot in his thigh and groin. I mean, think about how close that shot must have been. It killed the dude standing next to Hitler. That's how close this shot was. And it dislocates Hitler's shoulder. In 1 minute of gunfire, there's 20 people who were killed. There's 4 Bavarian state police officers, 15 marchers, and a poor waiter who was just crossing the street at the wrong time, at the wrong place, and was shot and killed. Over 100 people were wounded. The push is over at this point, and Hitler is able to escape at this time. The owner of the beer hall, I thought this was a fun little stat here, ends up sending a bill to the NSDAP for 11.3 trillion marks for the repairs. So I just thought that was kind of funny. Like, hey, I know y'all are doing your thing, but we're going to go ahead and need to get our beer hall repaired, and that's going to be on your dime. So here's the bill. I imagine a day later, 2 days later, it was, like $3 or something like that. So what happened to Hitler? Well, he escapes. He's got that yellow Fiat I mentioned earlier. A buddy has it parked right outside city center. Jumps in. They escape 35 miles out of Munich, go to a friend's house. He was going to escape back to Austria at this time, but he was captured, ironically, on November 11th, 1923, 5 years to the day of the armistice going into effect in World War I. I just thought that was interesting. He ends up being sent to Landsberg prison. He gets placed in fortress confinement, which I guess is kind of like maybe protective custody, or I don't know what it would be. It's a very lenient form of confinement. He was allowed to kind of have his run of the mill. He was able to just hang out outside. He becomes prisoner number 45 and occupies Landsberg cell 5, which is, you can see here, it's got windows, albeit with bars over it.
So this is prior to his trial?
Yeah, this is before his trial and then after his trial.
Yeah, because I knew that he had some pretty plush deals after his trial. But what would you attribute this type of treatment in jail for? Does this kind of speak volumes to how he was viewed by some of the people in charge in Bavaria, or what do you think here?
Yeah, I mean, the judicial system in Bavaria at this time was, what's the word? I don't want to say sympathetic to the NSDAP's platform. I mean, to announce that would be pretty bold. But I think that the judicial system was just as disenchanted with the Weimar Republic as most other Germans. I mean, how could you not be as a ordinary citizen? Judges are, albeit they're kind of elite, I guess, in terms of where they are in the government, but they're still not immune to the economic woes that Germans were facing at this time. So
yeah, that makes sense.
I think that there was a lot of, I just don't want to use that word sympathy. You got a better word for me?
No.
Okay. It's all good, man.
I'll think about it. It'll come to me.
Maybe cautiously sympathetic, maybe. Or I don't know. But I think right here would probably be a good place to stop. We've told the story of the push. We can talk about the effects of it tomorrow. And that maybe the trial. I think the trial is a good example of propaganda, of also the weakness of the political system. So that's the story of the Beer Hall Putsch. Now, let's talk about this Google form. We're going to share this with you in your classroom. You'll see here, we've basically asked you a couple questions about the push itself. Are you able to hear me, Novelli?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, all right. There's a couple questions that are going to ask you to reflect on what we talked about yesterday, the 25-point program. Take your time. I like to say in a million words or less. Answer these questions. It's really designed for you to engage with the content, and then to also demonstrate that you're opting into this I want to be clear that the Sumner School District's been very clear in their messaging to us that there's not to be any new learning that's mandated. This is for you guys to keep up. My assumption is that the IB tests are still going to happen in May, and I feel compelled and obliged to do my best and Novelli his best to prepare you for that, despite the fact that we're not at school in person right now, and we simply cannot afford to wait a whole lot longer to continue to get to I guess to teach you guys. So that's what we're doing here. We're not going to be adding any of this into the grade book. This is simply for you to learn and prepare to the best of your ability for the IB exam on the assumption that it's going to happen in May. You want to add anything to that, Novelli?
Yeah, you got nothing better to do, okay? So go ahead and do this because it'll help you guys.
Yeah, you sound auto-tuned right now. It sounds like auto-tune you got going on over there.
Like T-Pain?
Yeah, something's up, man. Something's up with your audio, but it's all good, man. So yeah, you got nothing better to do than to listen to us two on this what is this anyways? It's not a podcast, but
oh no, I cannot give myself that label.
No.
It's a instructional video, an instructional conversation.
Yeah.
Can I ask you?
Go ahead.
Let me ask you one quick question because I wrote this down at the beginning of your lecture. So I just want to make sure I'm clear on something. So you make the point that the beer hall putsch is ultimately a failed use of force. So does that mean that it's a failure insofar that the use of force was not successful, or I mean, you would still classify it as a use of force. It's just
Correct.
that the outcome wasn't successful, right?
Correct. I would say it was a failure in the objectives Hitler had at the time.
Okay.
The objectives Hitler had at the time were to establish a new government in Germany led by his political party. His objective failed. However, the propaganda he was able to produce as a result of this, when he could cherry pick some of those pictures and the stories. I mean, he was able to produce.
You could even make the argument, even his time in prison was helpful in consolidating his ideology and beliefs. I mean, that's where he wrote Mein Kampf.
Correct. Yeah. And that is the argument I would make, is that and it's the argument Hitler made, that without his imprisonment, Mein Kampf does not get written. So we got to talk about his trial. We'll do that tomorrow. It'll be a lot shorter of a lesson tomorrow. So
cool.
So, all right, let's wrap it up, man. Let's stop keeping these guys hostage, and
okay.
We'll let's see, stop the share here. Well, it's beautiful outside again, man. It's like the one upside to being stuck at home is at least we can go outside. You got any words of wisdom for these guys before we turn them loose?
No,
cool.
Not till tomorrow.
Okay. I think eventually the plan will be to have them in these meetings. Potentially. Okay. I've got it set up to where we can kind of control, mics and video and all that stuff. But I think that's ultimately what the district is wanting us to do eventually, is just to have these meetings online. So,
okay.
So we'll see. But until then, y'all have a good afternoon.
Bye, guys.
All right, buddy. Later.